Hi, so I'm Suzanne Michal and I consider myself a death taboo breaker. So I work around death. I do various things. I run a death cafe in London. I've created a workshop to allow people to explore death. I work on a one-to-one with people who have been bereaved and who want a spiritual approach to their bereavement. I'm writing at the moment a book with an inmate on death row. And today I would like to share some of my experiences I've had with death. So my intention in sharing those experiences is for myself personally to break years of silence, and that silence ultimately affected my health and my well-being, but to allow other people to feel free in indeed breaking the taboo around death, but breaking the taboo around mystical experiences around death. I also want to make it clear that although what I'm going to share might help people who are bereaved in their suffering and might give hope, that is actually not my aim. It might be a byproduct, but it's not why I'm sharing. I'm sharing to expand people's awareness and thinking and the pool of knowledge and information there is around death. If it helps someone who is bereaved and suffering, and if it brings hope, it's great. But I want to add nonetheless that despite the fact that I've had those experiences, I have very much been bereaved and suffered from the physical loss of someone I've loved. So my first encounter with the other side of death, if we want to call it like that, was when I was 24 years old. In 1989, my husband committed suicide. So I just need to give you a tiny bit of background before. By that time, we were actually separated because our relationship had gone pretty violent and actually life-threatening for me. So I had no more news of him for maybe a few weeks. And at some point, I actually started shaking, and I was shaking constantly for about 4 days. And I was staying at my mom's at the time, and I remember telling my mom, Jean-Luc's going to die, and this is why I'm shaking. And my mom got quite upset, and she was, well, don't speak like that, why are you speaking like that? And we knew he was psychologically very disturbed. He had already tried to commit suicide twice in his life, when he was much younger, when he was a teenager. But it's like I had this knowing inside of me, and this knowing was so strong that, as I said, I was constantly shaking and becoming very distressed. I was also planned to, the following week, to go and live in Haiti in the West Indies, where my sister lived, in order to actually remove myself from this very difficult situation with my husband that had been going on for the last 2 or 3 years, with lots of violence and instability, and him going more and more schizophrenic. That's one aspect. So I was really afraid that he was actually going to die when I would be in Haiti, and that for me would have been awful, because I wanted to not be that far away if really we were going to face the fact that he was going to die. So I think it was the fourth day of that shaking and that awful knowing of he's going to kill himself, he's going to die, I woke up very early, around 6 a.m., something like that probably. And I went to the kitchen, I had something to drink, and I must have had a very high level of anxiety inside of me. And I went back to sleep, and I had this vision in my sleep. For me, it's my first vision of the other side, if we can use that language, where suddenly I saw Jean-Luc, I saw my husband, but on a level of energy. I didn't see him physically, I didn't see his physical body, but it's like I saw his energy field. And his energy field was, it happened quite quickly, was going through a complete collapse. And this collapse was also the merging of his energy field with a much bigger energy field. And so there was the collapse and a simultaneous integration with something much bigger, which was of the same nature. It's very difficult to put in words. I've since learned about the vision of the Amerindians, who talk about when you die, your spirit merges back with the great spirits. We can use the language of science, which is merging back with the quantum field or consciousness, our own individual consciousness, re-merging with a bigger consciousness. But it's what I experienced. Then I heard the phone ringing, so I was in that sleep, a morning sleep, very disturbed, having had this vision, and I heard the phone ringing. And when I heard the phone ringing, I instantly knew it was the phone call to tell me that Jean-Luc had died. And can't really remember because it was a long time ago, but just saying it, I can just feel my heart pounding in my chest, and I would imagine this is what happened to me. Actually, before his energy field collapsed, I was very aware of his energy field connecting with me. It was connecting in a quite aggressive manner, but there was definitely a point where, bam, I received his energy very, very strongly, and then that collapse, and then that merging. So my mom answered the phone, and then she came to see me, and then yes, it was the phone call from the police, where he was in the central of France, to say that they had found him. He had died, maybe he had killed himself through gas. So I think quite quickly the smell of gas was reached neighbors or something like that. So he had died not that long ago. When you talk about seeing an energy field merging another energy field, it has nothing to do with this dimension, with race realms. So for a very long time, I couldn't really understand what I had seen, but that was the moment of his death. Quite a while later, I can't remember if it's, let's say, a year later, again, during a night, during my sleep, I had a vision where I connected with him. I was very present with him, but him not as he had been when he was alive. But I was, or we were, at a scale of planets. I was being able to witness a landscape as if I was able to be at the level of planets, literally. And it was like gigantic wheels spinning. And what was incredible is that landscape was also emanating a music, a melody, as if everything was one. The melody, the landscape, the size of it, the space even between those planets or those wheels, those structures. and his being, all of that was just one. And funnily enough, he was a musician, and there was music emanating from this landscape, and I was very privileged to have access to that dimension of where he was at that time. Haiti was an interesting culture because people, generally speaking, had a very open awareness about spiritual manners, and there was open beliefs around death, around soul, and so on, which was just part of the general culture. So I think this is maybe the context within which my experience happened, but because it happened in Haiti, maybe this is why it happened and it could happen. So in 1997, I had a lover who was much older than me, and suddenly out of the blue he just died. And I was very distraught because I really liked him. He was like a friend and a lover. And he lived in another town, so he would only come at weekends, so usually on a Friday. Suddenly he would arrive and spend the weekend in the capital with us. He was a very interesting guy, and he also took me into places of Haiti where I wouldn't have gone on my own. So suddenly it was like I had lost all of that. I had lost my friends, I had lost his company, I had lost his support, and I was very, very distressed. So I was at my sister's. She lived in a beautiful gingerbread house, and it was Friday afternoon, and suddenly I realized that was the time where normally Lucien would have arrived. So it was very emotional to remember that fact. So I very much felt, well, let's have a cup of tea, because normally this is what we would have had done when Lucien arrived. We just had a cup of tea, sit together, start talking. So I went to do a cup of tea, I came back, and my mom was there visiting us. So I laid the table with our 3 cups. And next to me there was an empty chair, and suddenly on that empty chair, very, very, as graphic, as solid, that as if Lucien was there, but Lucien was there. Suddenly, boom, his presence was there. And it was very, very potent. It was very surprising. So surprising that I actually said to my mom and to my sister, oh my God, I'm actually feeling that Lucien is there. And both my mom and my sister went, yes, we can feel that. So because it was so obvious that Lucien was there, his spirit was there, his soul was there, that I said, well, okay, well, I'm going to put a cup of tea for Lucien. So I went and brought a cup of tea for him. And he used to be a chain smoker. So I said, right, well, we need to have a cigarette for Lucien. So I went in the house, found some cigarettes, an ashtray. I lit up the cigarettes, and the cigarette was burning at his place. And it was very odd on one level, because the chair was empty. There was nobody physically, but Lucien was there nonetheless. His presence was there. So it was, and it happened so spontaneously. It was actually beautiful on one way. So the cigarette smoke just went, and Lucien was there, and Lucien just died. So it was very painful at the same time. And in those days, we used to look at some cards, some Osho cards actually. And at one point I felt like, wow, well, let's pick up some cards, and let's pick up a card for Lucien. We're all going to pick a card. So I said, well, okay, well, I'm going to pick up a card for Lucien. And the card I picked up was acceptancy. And that moment, it was very powerful, because not only Lucien's spirit or soul was there, his presence was there. It was very raw that he had died, and I was very much in pain, but it was beautiful that he was there, and he was really there. And my mom and my sister could also feel that. But suddenly we get this message for him and from him of acceptance, of really accept that I've just died, accept your pain, accept everything. And that's something I've never forgotten. And suddenly, as quickly as his presence had been there with us, boom, his presence was gone. Suddenly, boom, Lucien wasn't there with us anymore. And so it was like, wow, well, Lucien's gone. And both my mom and my sister went, yeah, we feel he's gone. And that remains for me as a very soothing and beautiful memory. I remember how I suffered from his loss, but that was a beautiful moment, very, very unique. And I think it was possible to happen because it was held in that Haitian culture where things like that were normal. And I was very lucky enough that both my mom and my sister were witness and were able to validate that phenomena. The last time I saw Lucien alive, which was probably just a week before or 2 weeks before, he arrived and he said to me, right, let's go down to Port-au-Prince, downtown Port-au-Prince, which could be potentially a very rough place to go, and you would have to know your way around. And he took me to places which I had never been, places where artists, Haitian artists, would display their work for themselves. We bumped into, I remember, a mad person, because in Haiti lots of people are mad, they've lost their sanity through trauma, and he had the most amazing respectful interaction with this person who was obviously completely mad. And then he explained to me that this man had been a fellow teacher with him, and he still had an absolute relationship of respect, even if this person lived like a homeless, tramp, mad person in the streets of Port-au-Prince. Anyway, by the time we came back and we parted, we said goodbye, I remember having a very strong sense of oozing gratitude and appreciation for him, and appreciation for him in my life. And I remember expressing that to him. I was just thanking him. It was really coming from my heart, and I felt so grateful to have Lucien in my life and for who he was. And that's the last time I saw him alive. So again, it's very interesting when you look back on those events and you think, wow, it's amazing. How come at that precise moment I had this very strong feeling, was able to share that with him, and then that's the last time I see him alive. Those for me are mystical moments as well. They're very subtle, but they are mystical. In 1998, I was still living in Haiti, and in those days I was a Buddhist. I used to go to Buddhist meetings on a Saturday morning, and there was a woman who was Haitian, but she lived in the States and worked in the States. She was an air hostess, so from time to time, on a very regular basis, she had time off work and she would come to Haiti and just spend time with us. And be back in our home country. And she was a very, very strong woman, very forceful personality. And I remember one Saturday morning, I went to the Buddhist center and I entered the room where we used to chant. And I was a bit late and people were already chanting, and I arrived from the back of the room, and instantly I felt something was severely wrong. And it's almost as if my consciousness split in two. So there was my normal awareness of what's going on, and I had this sub-extra consciousness that could perceive something else that wasn't visible, if I can put it like that. And that other level of consciousness went, wow, something is so wrong. And I looked at Liliane, and Liliane was Liliane, but for me there was something profoundly wrong with her. I can't really put words, but I was couldn't even understand what was going on, because on one level everything was normal, but on another level, at a very profound level, it was like, whew, something is absolutely not the way it should be. And I looked at her, and the only way I could describe it was as if you see an ocean, and this ocean is usually very forceful and with strong waves and strong winds. That would have been Liliane's personality. And I looked at her, and this ocean was flat, completely flat. But she was normal, but for me it was like I couldn't comprehend what was happening. And then I looked at the room, and the room also was completely wrong. And I felt very strongly that some people were in this room that weren't meant to be in this room. And anyways, I went with the chanting, we had our meeting, and I had to be involved in the normality and the first level of living something, but in my awareness something else was happening, which I had almost to discard because I couldn't understand and I couldn't relate. The following morning around 5 a.m., very, very early, we got a phone call that Liliane had been attacked and she had been rushed to a hospital. A hospital is a grand word for Haiti, but the hospital. And we were asked to go and see her. So we went with my sister, and it was a very barren hospital. Imagine a hospital which is very minimalist, so you have rooms and places where a doctor is meant to do things, but it's like there is nothing or not much. So Liliane was lying, very, very profoundly damaged. She had been attacked by machete. So she was cut very, very severely, so severely that I remember I could see her bones. So it was disturbing being with her, and she was fully conscious. You could speak to her. I think her eyes were closed because she must have been in a very profound state of trauma and physiological trauma, because she had lost a lot of blood, and she was there on a table with nothing, no painkiller, no blood was given to her. She was just there. So I cannot comprehend the level of trauma inside of her and what had happened to her during the attack. So remember, we could speak with her, we could ask her very basic things, because obviously she was Haitian, but she lived in the States, and she had like a health insurance with the States, and obviously Haiti being Haiti, it made sense for her to go to the States. So we were asking her things like, where is your passport? Very, very basic things, and she could reply. And at one point she said she needed to wee, and the nurse came with like those plateaux, and Liliane had the strength, I don't know how, to lift her body. She was quite a strong woman. So the nurse could put the plateau under her, and Liliane was yelling in pain. It was very disturbing. That lasted for quite a long time, where she was just left like that with no medical support whatsoever. And then finally she was taken away. I imagine they stitched what they could stitch, cleaned her wounds. Anyway, the last time, finally afterwards I saw her, she was in a hospital bed. She had bandages, her wounds had been taken care of, And finally she had drips, and I expect she was on morphine or some type of painkillers. She was receiving blood because she must have lost a lot of blood. And very, very quickly it became very evident that she was entering in a coma, but the way she was entering in a coma was very violent. She started to be extremely violent in her body movements, trying to actually remove the things that were where the needles are, and trying to remove. So I remember several nurses had to kind of hold her body, and she was strong, and she started to become very disorientated. It wasn't possible anymore to have a conversation with her. And after the phase of violence, suddenly she became more and more still, and quite quickly she entered in a coma. Then it was still early in the morning, I think. We were with Liliane, who was in a coma, who had been very damaged. So then other people came, people were in touch with our boss in the States and so on, and it was agreed that yes, she should be flown to the States and have proper health care, or the best health care she could receive. So someone had to go with her because she was in a coma, and if she was to come out of her coma, because she was going to move country, apparently it's good for the person to have someone with them that they can relate to. So because I was in Haitian, I had a passport, I must have had a visa to go to the States. I wasn't really working, I was flexible, so I was asked if I would go with her, so I said yes. So I think that same day, an ambulance plane came from the States. This American team came, everything was extremely fast. They came, they collected us. We were taken back to the airport, and I remember this very, very surreal moment where we were just by the plane, this tiny, tiny plane, which inside is an ambulance, is like a medical unit, under that soaring heat of Haiti, and Liliane just like a dead body with the wind moving the sheet above us, above her, and me really wondering if she was going to come back and be alive, or was she going and to die. And I was constantly speaking to her and holding her and explaining what was going on, because I felt even if she's in a coma, she's part of her consciousness is aware. So I was trying to explain to her what she was going to be transferred to the States. I was going with her and all of that. We arrived in the States, she was rushed out, and I had to go through the customs and all of that, and then meet her back at this very, very, very modern, state-of-the-art hospitals. Again, that was an incredible contrast from where we'd been in Haiti. So in that hospital, she was in a unit on her own, which was like a bedroom, but it was also an operating block. She could be operated where she was in her bed. And I stayed there. She lived for 4 days, basically. So during those 4 days, I was there as much as possible, and I was constantly speaking to her, touching her, stroking her. And because we were Buddhist, I was a Buddhist in those days, I was also chanting a lot to her. And for those 4 days, I had very minimalist amount of sleep. It was very intense, very extreme. And in a way, I had to let go of my desire for her to stay alive, because I was facing this woman who was in a coma, who was very damaged. Her body was very damaged, let alone her emotional body and all of that. And who I was to decide, live, 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 you have to live, or oh, I'm going to have to accept you're going to die. It very much felt it had nothing to do with me. Those answers were so beyond me, so I had to completely let go and just chant for her, for the best, way beyond what my ego would have liked. And the more I chanted, the more the days went, and it was very, very intense, and I was just chanting and staying by her. And at one point she was actually operated on her brain because the machete had also cut in her head, and she had a wound in her brain. And by that time the wound in her brain, well, I think there was so much pressure on her brain that she was going to become brain damaged, so they had to actually operate on her brain. And I just went out of her room, which was an operating block, and I could see her being operated on her brain, and I just watched it and I was chanting. And again, it was very, very surreal, with no guarantee. Is she going to live? Is she going to die? Is she going to ever come out of that coma? And realizing that has nothing to do with me, with my wants, nothing. So by the third day of that intensity, I started reaching a point of, I didn't see life and death as duality. I started seeing life and death as oneness. And it was very odd because, again, it wasn't a rational process, it wasn't an intellectual process, it was just a process that was happening to me by the intensity of what I was living, and plus the spiritual energy I was putting in it. So being in that space of life and death is the same. It's like I couldn't see any more duality, I couldn't see any more separation, I couldn't even see why we've got those two worlds. It just seems it was just different facets of the same thing. I became even more free in my chanting, in my approach to Liliane, whether she was going to die, whether she was going to live. It was almost irrelevant. I had gone to something completely much deeper, like touching an essence of something that had nothing to do with her being alive or her being dead, or what we call that. And on the fourth morning, I went back to the hospital after a very, very short night, where I was probably even chanting in my sleep and in any moment of awareness, and nonetheless giving her spiritual support. I entered in her space where she was in the hospital, and Liliane was glowing. She was extraordinarily beautiful. She was glowing. She was exactly the same in that coma, which is, it's very odd, spending 4 days next to someone in a coma. And I was mesmerized with how she was. And I went, oh my God, Liliane, you're incredibly beautiful. And I couldn't believe it. And I went to her and I grabbed her hands, as I did every day, and as soon as I touched her hand, I let go of her hand, and I felt repulsion because I couldn't relate to the sensation of her hand. At that moment, a doctor came in and actually told me that Liliane had just died. So in fact, I had just touched the body of someone who just died, and hence I had this sensation of repulsion, because it was the first time I touched a dead body, yeah. So I couldn't comprehend. So when I realized she had died, I went back to see her and speak to her essence and say a goodbye, I expect. Long time. First of all, I never talked about that story because it was very, very upsetting, and I would start shaking, and I couldn't cope with the intensity of what I had lived during those 4 days. So again, it became trapped inside of me. But what also became trapped inside of me was like, how come someone who had been brutally attacked by machete. We don't even know if she was raped before, or we don't know what exactly happened. We just know she was severely damaged. Then in a coma for 4 days. But at the moment of her death, starts oozing a beauty beyond words, light, shining, be completely transformed despite the horrific manner into which she was killed. So that, for me, is something very powerful to ponder, and it's very powerful also to ponder from the perspective of where I had reached, of something that was beyond the duality of life and death and the duality of many of our thinking as people, because really the logic would have been, because of the way she had been traumatized and killed, she should have died in hell or in something dark. But it's not that I saw. I experienced something completely the opposite. So now I have some perspective on that, but that was a powerful point in my journey around death. What did it mean that Lillian at that moment was shining light and beauty beyond words? In 2008, I was confronted to yet again several days of very intense experiences around me curing myself from ME and my sister dying, all in the space of a week, the same week. So a bit of background. I had been ill with ME for a year, and I did a technique called the lightning process, where you learn about neurological connections in your brain that maintains an illness, and you can have spontaneous remission. And on the second day I had the spontaneous remission. And that night, after I had my spontaneous remission, I woke up early in the morning, like when my husband died, and went back to sleep. And the way I live it is like literally I'm in my bedroom, I wake up, realize it's very early, close my eyes again, and boom, I'm somewhere else. But that somewhere else is even more real than me being here. And I won't go into the details of that place, but in that place, in that other dimension, in that other space, which was super real, super precise, at one point I collapsed and I came out of my body. And the way I came out of my body was by being a ball like that, this size. And this ball of energy, which was, let's say, my spirit, my essence, that ball of energy could travel at incredible speed, go through matter, and that's part of that experience. But anyway, the next day, out of the blue, we get a phone call to tell us that my sister has got leukemia. In those days, she was living in Haiti, so we had no means of being with her, and in fact she didn't have leukemia, she had acute leukemia. So it was a massive shock. And my mom, who had been looking after me and my daughter whilst I was ill with ME, because I was in my recovery phase now, we decided she would go back to Paris, because my sister was going to be flown from Paris, from Port-au-Prince to Paris, to receive proper medical support. So on the second night after I was cured, I wake up in the middle of the night, or rather around 4 a.m., and I'm in a state of awe, heightened energy and heightened super elation. I think the word would be elation and awe, because I had just lived being in pure white light, and being with beings of light. One word would be angels, but they were beings of light, and I knew it had to do with my sister, with Cathy, and Cathy was kind of there, or it was her, and all that show of light and angels and beings of light had to do with her. And I came out of this incredible vision. Again, it's, as I said to start with, it's a vision that my brain has difficulties really retaining, but I know of the intensity and I know of what I've lived, was such that despite the fact that I was just recovering from ME, where I hadn't really been able to walk for a year, I found myself in the middle of the night dancing in my flat, and I was dancing and I was singing and I was laughing, and because I was like, that was extraordinary, that's the most beautiful thing I've ever experienced. It has put me in a state of deep euphoria, and I know it has to do with my sister, and that was just so extraordinary beyond anything that could be the most extraordinary thing I could live on this planet. So I was dancing, I was in that completely incredible state, and I was like, wow. And that was the night my sister was flying from Haiti to Paris. So I was like, wow, well, as soon as she arrives in Paris and I can speak to her, I'm going to tell her she's got angels around her. And I wasn't really into angels, so but I was in that incredible space. And as the morning progressed, very quickly that euphoria completely collapsed into a dread, a profound dread that was destroying me inside of me. And that dread was Cathy's died. And again, it was like a knowing that had nothing to do with my rational mind. And finally, I dropped my daughter to her friends, and I walked back to our house, and I was walking very slowly, and I was in my head having an internal dialogue with Cathy, with my sister. And I was kind of saying to her, it's okay, you can die, you can be dead, it's okay, you know, I'll cope. And I was really talking from a place of profound compassion for her and kind of reassuring her, it's okay, I'll cope, and all of that. And suddenly I caught myself in that mental and emotional space, and I was so angry at myself, and I was like, how dare you be negative like that, how dare you think Cathy has died. And I was almost in self-hatred. Anyway, when I arrived home, I straight away rang my dad, because by now Cathy should be in France, she should be in a hospital, because she would have landed in France around 6 a.m. So I rang my dad, who very slowly broke the news to me of what had happened, which in fact my sister boarded the plane with her husband. She kind of entered the coma as she boarded the plane. An hour later, the plane was in Guadeloupe. She had to be rushed in hospital, and within a few hours, she died. So she died around 10 p.m. in Guadeloupe, which was 4 a.m. my time. So exactly the time when I had that extraordinary connection with her. So I can honestly say that losing my sister is one of the most painful events of my life. But I have to also say that what I have experienced, which was the moment of her death, in fact, is and remains to be the most extraordinary experience I've ever had. It was the most beautiful, the most awe-inspiring, elating moments, and I feel extremely privileged that I was able somehow to have a glimpse to, I don't know if I was invited there or how come I was able to have a glimpse of that event, but I have. So again, a huge contrast between the pain of losing my sister and this incredible event who has shaped who I've become. 4 days after Cathy died, I was in France with my brother, my mom and my dad, and we decided my dad would go to Haiti for the funeral. Anyway, we were all reunited. It was very, very painful. And finally, everybody leaves. My brother goes back to his work, and I'm on my own with my mom. And it was late in the evening, and I could hear my mom. My mom just went into shock after Cathy died, and I could see the light in my mom's bedroom. So I went to speak with my mom, and she was just like totally blanked. And we were just talking and trying to be with our own suffering. And finally I went back to my bedroom, and I went into bed, and I remember I lied like that. And as soon as I lied like that, a ball of energy about this big literally landed just there and stopped just there above my shoulder. And it felt that this ball was traveling at a speed I cannot comprehend, but a speed like I had never experienced anyway. I've never experienced anything like that, and I've never heard of someone else tell me about a story like that. It happened very fast, so I'm very distraught, just been with my mom who was very distressed, go to bed, lying like that, shoom, this thing that's flying and comes to me at an incredible speed, arrives and stops just there. And in my mind it went very, very fast, and I went like, oh my God, I've never experienced anything like that. This thing is very strongly there, this ball. Cathy's just died. It must be Cathy. Are you Cathy? And instantly as I asked the question, are you Cathy? Shoo, it's as if this ball touched me, merged with me, and here in my right shoulder I felt warmth, and only there in my body. And this warmth entered my body and my being became completely infused in peace. Again, a peace I've never experienced. A very profound peace, a peace that, I don't know, I've never experienced a peace like that since. And I actually moved, which I now regret because I think maybe I've disrupted something, but I moved in my bed. And that was it. I was just left with this warm shoulder and this incredible peace that lasted several days. Again, it is not after several days, several weeks, several months of starting to integrate those events that I looked back. And I remembered that exactly the week before was the day I had that experience when I was doing the lightning process, where in my state of awareness of being in another dimension, I collapsed and out of my body. I came out of my body and traveled as a ball of energy that big. So again, it was like, was I shown something? Was I explained something so that I could receive Cathy? I don't have the answers to those questions. How could I perceive with what sensory organ? Now I know we've got psychic awareness, we've got all sorts of other senses. But those are very profound moments, even if they're very, very short in time. This encounter with the ball must have lasted only 2 seconds, very, very quick. But so powerful that this is why I do the work I do now around death. So on the 11th of January 2010, Again, I had the forewarning. I was on a bus, a London bus, a double-decker upstairs, and early in the morning, and I saw a hearse in the street. And when I saw the hearse, I just burst into tears. And I absolutely couldn't understand my reaction, and I was kind of, that was 2 years after my sister died, so I was much more in integration. I was feeling okay, so I really couldn't understand my reaction. And that morning I had woken up and I was writing about where I was, and I had actually written about my night, and I had expressed hatred, absolute hatred for that night, and how that night had challenged me at a level of absolute hatred that I couldn't really understand, but this is what I had written. Then I see this hearse, I burst into tears, and I'm like, I can't really rationally make sense. Come back home and the phone rings, and it's my dad on the phone. And my dad asked me if I was aware that the night before in Haiti there had been a very important earthquake. And when I got the news of the earthquake, I fell into a rage because Haiti is a country that has suffered a lot, humanly, politically, economically, for several centuries. And now on top of it, there was this huge earthquake. So the only thing I knew was there had been a huge earthquake affecting Port-au-Prince, and I have family in Port-au-Prince. There was the husband of my sister, Misha, a very important person in my life. There was the father of my own child. I had my nephews. I had lots of friends. I had lived in Port-au-Prince. I knew about Haiti since I was 12 years old. Misha was a very important person in my life since I was 12. So there was the not being able to note the extent of the damage. There was not yet media coverage, really. I didn't have a TV, so I didn't have access to media coverage. There was no more communication possible with Haiti. You couldn't pick up a phone and ring. There was no more communication. So I knew we had to wait. And it was just awful. So for me, the worst scenario was that Misha had been killed. That for sure, that for me was the worst scenario, because I'd known him since I was 12. He was a very important person in my life. He had been the husband of my sister. He was there when Cathy died. That was something I absolutely couldn't comprehend. So as the hours passed and I was exposed to media coverage through the TV, and I realized the extent of the destruction, beyond my own anxiety, my own suffering, there was the acknowledgement that that was a catastrophe on a much, much bigger scale than just my own, but my own was part of that massive scale of destruction and deaths and losses. And so as I embarked on that period of waiting to finally get information from what was happening in Haiti, I had to deal with my rage. I was very afraid of myself. I was actually afraid that if I got the news that Misha died in the earthquake, I was going to trash everything in my house. I felt I'm going to be capable of actually breaking everything in my house out of my rage and my incapacity of accepting this event. So that I was very afraid of that, of my own reaction. I also put like an inner wall. I wanted to wall myself. And again, there was a strange duality where I'm a mom, I have friends who are supporting me, so I was in interaction with the outside world, but really inside of me, I put a wall around me, and I put myself inside that wall, and I didn't want to have to communicate with another human being anymore. I just wanted to be walled. And we waited for nearly 48 hours. And at one point the phone rang, and when I took the phone, I heard the voice of the father of my daughter. And that's it. So I knew he was alive. And then we waited, and on the second day, again, at one point I got very angry at myself. I got angry at myself for passively just waiting, and I was like, wow, you're sensitive, you so-called psychic and are clairvoyant and all of that, so just be proactive and go in a trance and connect with Misha and be proactive and figure out what's going on. But that just passively waiting was just awful. So I went on my bed and I went into a trance-like state or a deep relaxation, and I connected with Misha, and very clearly I got the sensation that Misha was buried. Misha was buried alive under rubble, and he was alive, and suddenly he wasn't alive, and it was a bit confusing. But I got the very clear sensation that yes, Misha was under rubbles. Yeah, by then we had the official news that Misha Gaillard was considered as dead in the earthquake, because Misha was part of a program to reform the judiciary system in Haiti. He was a political figure. He was quite an important figure in Haiti in terms of reforming and rebuilding a political system there. So in the American press, it had come out that he was considered as having died in the earthquake. So my dad had told me, okay, Misha is officially considered dead in the earthquake. And I refused to believe that. I refused to believe any official information, and I was like, I will believe it only when I have the news from someone I can relate to. And I think it was through Twitter or something like that, some very odd way of communicating, that finally we got the information on that second day, after I did the remote viewing, that yes, he had passed away. And the story being that his children, who were 17 and 19 at the time, were in their house, which was a wooden gingerbread house, so they were still alive. And the following day, after the first night after the earthquake, they went to the site where the Ministry of Justice was, because they guessed that Misha must have been in the ministry, and everything was destroyed. And by shouting and all of that, they found Misha, and they could actually speak to Misha. Misha was buried under the ruins of the Ministry of Justice, but they could communicate. And it took them 2 days to finally, with some friends, be able to go back and start removing rubbles. It was very complicated, apparently. I can imagine the entire city was destroyed and covered in rubbles, but also covered with dead bodies. There is an estimated 500,000 of people who were killed. So on that second morning, when finally they managed to come to Misha, who was actually from his leg down completely crushed, and completely covered in dust. The only thing they could do was wash his face with water and just put a tiny bit of water on his lips, and he died. In one way, it's very beautiful because he was reunited with his children. He was reunited with the outside world. He didn't die on his own. On the other level, it's very painful. He spent nearly 48 hours buried alive and crushed. His legs were apparently completely crushed. Anyway, they managed to completely undug his body and bury him in their garden. So I had the confirmation of my remote viewing that yes, he had been buried, yes, he was buried alive, then at one point he died. He very quickly moved from the state of being alive to dying. I have a friend who went to Port-au-Prince within the few days after the earthquake. He's a documentary filmmaker specialized on natural disaster. And he's also a sensitive person like me. And when he was in Port-au-Prince, very quickly he got the sense that there were a lot of souls who had died, but who hadn't realized they had died. So they were just kind of like hanging above Port-au-Prince and in an absolute state of confusion. And they seemed to be going towards the cathedral, which was also destroyed, because this is where he felt that phenomena the most. And he spontaneously decided to do some sort of ceremony to help those souls move on. So he went back one evening on his own accord with his cameraman and a photographer to spontaneously do something, because it was extremely overwhelming for him to feel all those souls in that state of confusion. So he went by the cathedral and he spontaneously did what he felt like doing. And whilst he was doing his ceremony, his photographer was photographing him. And you can see the cathedral, and then you can see the cathedral literally as if it's in snow, under snow, because it's covered in orbs. Again, those balls, those spheres, like when Cathy came to see me. So many of them, it's like it's snowing. And then you can see another type of orbs coming who are different, who are archangels, guides, who knows. We can put words, but we don't really know. It doesn't really matter. But the phenomena is there, and the phenomena is taken on photo. And suddenly, shoof, they're all gone. And again, there is no more orbs, no more nothing, only the cathedral. So that was very interesting when I connected with Misha after he had died. I think it was probably 9 months after Misha died. I had the spontaneous connection with both him and Cathy, actually. And I very much felt that for Misha, there was not only the fact that he had died himself, but there was also the awareness in those 40 so hours when he was dying, buried alive, of the weight of those hundreds of thousands of other people who had died. In the space of several days, hundreds of thousands, like 500,000 people died. And he was not just dying himself, but he was very aware of that. So when finally he died, it's like his soul, his spirit was dealing not just with the trauma of his own death, but the general trauma of collective death. So when I connected with him, all those months later, which was very spontaneous connection, I didn't wanted, it just happened. He was actually being healed. He was being healed at that level of his own trauma, the way he had died, but also the trauma of dying with lots of people dying at the same time. And there was lots of different him, if I can put it like that. So there was his physical body who was buried in the garden. And it was good, it was in the garden, it was good his physical body hadn't been moved a lot because of the level of trauma. So his physical body was there and was very much in need of just resting and not being moved and be able to integrate his death and the death of all those people. Then there was another frequency of him where he was lying on a bed of crystal light, if I can describe it like that, a frequency of matter that doesn't exist on this plane. So it's like matter but not matter, and it retains the quality of light. And he was lying on that, and around him there were beings of light, which I couldn't see their body, I could only perceive their clothing, which in a way wasn't clothing, was again layers of light or layers of density that were giving them a shape. And those beings were healing that vibrational body who was in that bed of crystal, again from his own trauma of his own death and the trauma of dying with lots of people. And there was again another frequency of Misha who was standing by the bed of crystal and observing. And the way that vibration of Misha was observing was with profound compassion. He had profound compassion for his physical body in the garden, who was buried in the garden. He had profound compassion for all the other people who had been killed, for his country. But when he was looking at that aspect of himself that was on that bed of crystal light, he had profound compassion for who he had been as a human being, with his flaws, with his strengths, with the full aspect of who he had been, the shadow aspect and the light aspect, where he had failed, where he had succeeded. I could just feel this incredible compassion, this incredible no judgment, an inability to look at every single detail of his life with this deep, deep love and compassion. I feel very moved when I talk about that. And then there was yet again another layer of him, which was completely detached from a sense of body, where he was with his children who were at the time living in Canada, and again he was there with them as a presence. Again as a compassionate presence, not as like I need to take care of them, or I need to do something, or a sense of guilt or blame, or nothing like that. Just like pure, loving compassion presence. And then he was with me in my lounge. I was working at my computer, it was the afternoon, and there was also one aspect of him that was there with me. And there was Cathy, and Cathy was with us as well. And very strangely, the way I perceive Cathy, so she was with us in my lounge. Me, I was still at my computer, I didn't move from my computer. But again, like with my late husband, the way I could perceive her was at a level of planetary scale, so something gigantic, and there was a kind of like planetary rise, like a sunrise, except it wasn't the sun, it was like a planet or something like a planet, and this planet was rising. And again, there was a sense of oneness, no more separation to what was that planet rising what was that kind of other planet that was creating the horizon, the presence of my sister in that rising, and the presence of me in being able to again have the privilege to witness and share something like that, while still being in my lounge, while still having Katy and Misha with me. So that was a very, very privileged moment to be able to live that. Felt very healing to be with them, to understand the level of healing that Misha had to go through and the level of support and profound compassion. For my sister, it was a sense of oneness, that she was somewhere completely different, but there was oneness, total oneness. I don't want to say anymore.